There is a video on YouTube entitled, Alan Watts Opens Up on Religion. You can search that in YouTube. I'm not going to put a link in my description. But in this video, I would like to provide my rebuttal to Alan Watts's ideas and his overall message. Why should this interest you or concern you? Well, the vast majority of people out there do not understand the Bible and where it came from. This includes English philosopher and writers from the past, such as Alan Watts. So then, if an idiot like me can make intelligent people such as Alan Watts look like fools, then wouldn't you want to have that knowledge? All right then, let me start off by saying who Alan Watts was, for those that don't know. Alan Watts was an English writer and philosopher. He is credited with the spread of Buddhism and Hinduism to Western societies. He died in 1973. Now, several YouTubers have taken some of Alan Watts's quotes or his talks and made videos out of them. And the one in particular that I'm talking about is where Alan Watts is discussing his opinion and his views on Christianity, the gospel, and Jesus. The overall message that Alan Watts is trying to convey in this video is that Jesus of Nazareth was a normal human being, a mystic, and not the Son of God in the way that the Christians claim he was. Alan Watts is saying Jesus is the Son of God, just like every single human being is the Son of God. However, it's the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church that have corrupted the true meaning of the gospel for monetary ambition. In his words, quote, "The gospel has been emasculated," end quote. Another quote that he says a couple of times is, quote, "The Christians have pedestalized Jesus of Nazareth," end quote. He goes on to say that Jesus of Nazareth had a cosmic religious experience sometime in his younger age that caused him to go out on his ministry and to open the eyes of the people to the fact that they are all gods and that they are all divine, according to what Alan Watts wants to say. And that this true message of the gospel has been suppressed by the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. And let me add that he also notes that this true meaning of the gospel, this suppressed gospel that the Catholic Church doesn't want you to know, has been known by the theologians, the mystics, the philosophers, such as himself, throughout history. His evidence for proving this point that Jesus didn't think he was special and that it was the Christians who distorted his message comes from John's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 30, when Jesus says, "I am the Son of God," and the Jews want to pick up stones and stone him for blaspheming, and he quotes from Psalms 82 saying that we are all gods, saying that they can't stone him, that Jesus was just claiming, no, we're all gods. And then he uses John's gospel where Jesus is praying that the disciples will be one, saying that just as the Father and I are one, so that you should be one. He uses these passages to prove his point that Jesus believed he wasn't special and that it was the Christians who distorted the true gospel. That's his overall message. Now then, Let me address some of his points and arguments. The first thing you can say about Alan Watts's ideas is they are highly conspiratorial, which include both Catholics and Protestants alike somehow conspiring together to keep this true gospel under wraps. And theologians on both sides, Protestant and Catholic, have understood the true meaning of the gospel, but have kept silent to the laity. I'm reminded of Dan Brown's fictional book, The Da Vinci Code. The only difference is Alan Watts's belief is on a much larger scale. It seems to include both Catholics and Protestants in cahoots together. Next point. At the beginning of his discussion, he says that it's the Catholic Church that gave the Bible to the people. I would argue that this is a historical inaccuracy. It's actually the Protestants that gave the Bible to the people. And not that I'm blaming them. I'm glad that Martin Luther and John Calvin translated the Bible so that many more could read it. However, in my argument, I don't think the Catholic Church wanted the people to have the Bible specifically because people like Alan Watts would interpret Jesus' sayings for their own opinions or their own beliefs. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 20 through 21, let no prophecy of Scripture be up for private interpretation. Which brings me to another colossal point against Alan Watts's belief, and that is that the New Testament writings were written by Christians for Christians. When Paul writes his letters in the first 20 years of Jesus' death, he's writing to established churches. The church is already established. Those letters were to the Galatians, the Corinthians, the Ephesians. Those were established churches that already had their beliefs before any gospel was written. There is this massive, naive understanding of the Gospels to be historical texts documenting the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. So many people believe that the gospel writers were more like journalists, unbiased journalists without any stake in what they were writing. How do we know they're not historical documentations? Because the Gospels all disagree on certain events, the birth narrative, when Jesus died, and what he said. Let me give you an example of the Gospel of Mark, the first one written, and how it was not written as a novel or as a historical documentation for a general audience. The original ending to Mark's Gospel ends with the women going to the tomb, seeing a man and sitting near the tomb, and they run in fright. That's the original ending. The rest was added, what historians believe, in the 7th or 8th century, explaining what happened to Jesus. So if Mark was writing for a general audience and said, here, give this to your Greco-Roman friends, they're not going to understand the whole idea of the risen Lord in the resurrection. What they read is an empty tomb. And they got to ask themselves, if you're, again, a Gentile in the Greco-Roman world, you got to ask yourselves, well, what the hell happened? What happened? Was his body stolen? Who's the guy next to the tomb? The Christians knew that. They knew the ending because the apostles and the disciples had already explained what happened to Jesus. So Mark can't be writing for ambition or for money or for fame or anything to a general audience with skipping the whole ending of what happened to Jesus altogether. It doesn't make any sense. How about Matthew's gospel? Matthew starts off his gospel with a genealogy. And if you're in the Greco-Roman world, you're a Gentile, do you have any idea who any of those people are? It has no meaning. You don't know who Adam or you don't know who David is. This genealogy was specifically written for Jewish converts. And every biblical scholar will tell you that Matthew's gospel was written specifically for Jewish converts, not a general audience. The reason you and I know about the genealogy is because the Catholic Church has assembled old Hebrew texts with the New Testament or the stories of Jesus' ministries with the letters. So you get the full picture. But when Matthew's gospel came out, the only people who would understand the genealogy would be people of Jewish descent. Let me give you an analogy. This is a fake headline, but I'm just going to, for the analogy purposes, I'm going to put up an article on CNN.com, and the headline reads, Howard Stern says to mic the situation at Whitney Houston's roast, that was uncool. Now, you probably understand those three people. You probably understand what a roast is. But what if I gave that article to someone in Japan, India, Australia, if I gave it to a general audience outside of America? Would they understand that? Gospels were written for Christians by Christians, for the Christian churches of Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor or Turkey, Macedonia, and Rome. So then, when Alan Watts wants to use the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 30, and I don't know what the passage is in when Jesus is talking to his disciples and praying that they will be one, he's claiming that those are truth and that everything else, the resurrection, well, those are all false because they disagree with his opinion. He's picking and choosing fact versus fiction. He seems to be suggesting that the author of John's gospel slipped up by accurately recording a conversation that Jesus had 60 years prior between him and the Jews, as well as a private conversation that Jesus had with his disciples. Meanwhile, at the beginning of his discussion, he claims that divinely inspired is questionable. And he also suggests that those messages by authors who claim to be divinely inspired are sometimes distorted because of the man's or the author's background, religion, language. So which is it, Alan Watts? Was the message of Jesus talking to the Jews, was that distorted by John? Was the conversation in the room, the private conversation that Jesus had with his disciples, was that distorted? Or are you calling that truth because it agrees with your opinion? The ridiculousness of the notion to say that John accurately documented an exchange between Jesus and his apostles and Jesus and the Jews, but John made up the whole idea of the resurrection is laughable. Add this to this conspiracy theory that the Catholic Church, just the theologians, just the really intelligent ones, picked up this other gospel from John's gospel and meaning, and they needed to suppress this hidden gospel that Jesus talked about. They needed to suppress that for 2,000 years, but the theologians and the people on top all knew it and were laughing at the rest of the people. Come on, Alan. What were you smoking in the 60s? That's a joke of an argument. Well, I could go on. I didn't even get into Paul the Apostle because explaining Paul's role in the spread of Christianity, but I'll have to save that for another day. To the person, the YouTuber who posted that video, I do understand why you deleted my comments. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.